Hey there, welcome to First Look. I'm back outside because it's nice, but I feel like every time I come out here I bring the rain, and I wish I meant that in some cool metaphoric way, but I think it's gonna rain a little bit, so I was like, I should do this before it actually rains. I'm already at a place where I don't know which direction to go, so we'll go this way. It looks flatter. All right, so we've moved out of that sermon series, and now I guess what you could call it is like a sermon in two parts, because I was kind of thinking through some stuff, and I thought you could think it through with me. So this past week, yesterday, we had How We Get Out. That was the name of the sermon. And the whole idea is like, how do I move from dealing with and processing the initial shock of blank, whatever blank happens to be. Could be someone passing away. It could be some other trauma. It could just be a big change. It doesn't always necessarily have to be even something bad, just something that I think applies to a significant change in life. And then we kind of work on how do we get out of that initial stage, where you're just trying to survive, because you may have or could be in a mode where you're either learning to survive in this new normal, or maybe all you know is survival mode. And from experience, that at some point gets a little old. So that being said, how is it that we move forward into the more thriving stage, or something that feels like you're moving forward at least? Because survival and depression can kind of coexist, or anxiety can kind of coexist. And as someone who has tried to kind of work through some of that for himself, one of the things I try to acknowledge and understand is how to try to manage it better, the best I can. And so that's just a part of the process, at least for me. So I started talking about how do I move forward, and the few things that I mentioned was that some part of this moving forward process, at least from my perspective, has to do with one, caring for yourself. But then I've come to realize that if I'm only caring for myself, then I never really get past me. I never really look beyond my own circumstances, which isn't always good. I have to look outwards. I have to try to find a way to actively show compassion and empathy, and maybe even share my story and whatever with other people. But if I only look outwards, if I only try to be helpful, if I only try to have my compassion or empathy pointed towards other people, then that feels very empty. Then you end up running on empty. So it can't just be about other people. And I think a lot of us do that. We bury ourselves in our work, or we bury ourselves in trying to be helpful to our families or relationships or whatever it happens to be, and we kind of ignore the self. So it also has to be our own needs also have to be considered. And then the third part was that I'm trying to ground myself in my faith. And you would think that for a pastor that might be easy. It's not always. In fact, very often it's not. Because when the Bible is your job, when you're doing something for work, I think it's a little bit like working at Disney World. You know what I mean? Like it has an element of like, do you really want to work in the places that you enjoy? But the church, that's no denying that church stuff is work too for me. So I have to find some kind of way of having my faith be kind of grown and developed, and have it as a centering point in some other way. And actually doing these things is very helpful. Not only doing it here in the woods or something, but just talking out loud about faith things I find helpful to me. Kind of devotional in a way. So that's kind of where I was headed. I feel like I was able to convey what I was trying to do. So that was kind of the first part. How do we get out? And then the second part for this week is how do we grow? That's the sermon title for this week. How do we get out, and then how do we grow? And so what that was meant to be was kind of the beginning of a process, and I'm following this course or this storyline, I guess I wanted to say, of Jesus going from hearing about and processing the death of John the Baptist, taking the time for himself, going beyond himself, participating in the healing and restoration of other people, showing empathy to other people, centering himself in his faith and prayer. And then this next story, it's the story right after that one, is another famous story about Jesus, visiting the disciples out on that boat, walking on the water. And I just saw a clip. Bill Goff likes this show, and now I've forgotten what the show is called. I don't think it's called The Disciples, but it's a show about Christ and his life with the disciples, and it looks very well done. I've just seen a little bit of it, but it looks very well done. And it shows this clip that he was showing me actually happens to follow right into this sermon. So I might review that again and see where it takes me. But so this happens right after the feeding of the 5,000, and it's one of those stories that it's kind of neat to think about from a couple of different perspectives. There's the Jesus perspective, there's the Peter perspective, and then there's the other people perspective. I guess the fourth one is you and I. I mean, you and I guess, are always there because we're the ones reading it, but those are the three that came to mind. So let me pause here now that I'm in a place where I think I can read without bothering anybody. And we're still in Matthew. This is still chapter 14, but it moves forward into verse 22 to 31, I think. So it says, "Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. Again, kind of doing the same. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come out onto the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and started walking on the water and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink, and he cried out, "Lord, save me," which is Hosanna, right? Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." It's a good story. So, I think the first element of that is for me was thinking about kind of you see the same pattern in this story as you kind of see in the feeding of the 5,000 story. You can almost kind of match it in some ways, line by line. So he kind of begins by setting up a time for him to be quiet. So he does that whole thing. And that's a good thing. So he does that same, like, caring for self kind of thing. And then he comes and there's this, he kind of shows up for them in a miraculous way, right? So the first miraculous thing that happens is that he walks on the water. And the first miraculous thing that happened in the other story was that he's curing the sick, right? So there's this moment where he goes from isolation and self-care to something where he's reaching out and helping, right? There's a helping moment, a miraculous helping moment. And then he has to do kind of there's a rebuke moment. It's a pretty mild rebuke, but there's still that moment. Like in the feeding story, he says to them, "Well, you're here, like, you go and do it. Like, don't send them away. Like, buck up. Like, let's go. Like, let's make this happen for them." And so they figure it out. With his help, they kind of make it all happen. So that's the other parallel. And then we see the same kind of, he calms the storm and he sort of settles everything down. He kind of collects everything and makes it okay, right? Like that's the way the story ends. It's kind of the way that ends with the feeding of the 5,000, right? He kind of makes everything okay with the feeding part. Like that's the part that's sort of the gathering, calming. Everybody's gonna be like, it's gonna be okay now moment. And it's sort of the same here, where you have the calming of the sea and everyone's in the boat and everyone's fine. And there's also there's a worshipful moment. This time though, it's a little bit different because it's slightly out of order. You had Jesus doing the blessing before the calming, and in this one, it's kind of something else. So, well, it's a moment where you have. I'm going to pause for a second because I got people. Hi. So you have a like a calming moment where the people at the end, the disciples at the end, once they're calmed, then they have the moment of kind of, you are clearly the Son of God. There's that kind of worshipful moment. So I think it's an interesting way that those sort of stories are layered on each other. Something I hadn't really thought about before. Sometimes you get theology on the fly here, where I'm just sort of thinking through things right in front of you. But I think the story is interesting as the next one to happen after the feeding of the 5,000, not only because of those parallels, but I think because it's like it's taking the moment of the feeding of the 5,000 and looking at it from the disciples' perspective as this kind of learning moment where right after John the Baptist dies, who would have been sort of the original creator of this revolution, you have these two things that happen that remind them of why they're following Jesus specifically. And the first one reminds them of kind of their place in the community that they're forming. Hey, you're the people now. You're the people who are making this happen. You don't have to go send them somewhere else. We don't have to go anywhere else. You're the leaders. You're the ones who are going to make these things happen. I'm going to be there to show you and to do this, my part, but you have to do your part. And so it's that participating thing that you also see in both, right? You see Jesus do something miraculous, and then the disciples have to participate. The same thing happens in this story. Jesus does something miraculous, and then Peter, and they witness or participate in something as a response. And so they're growing, and so if the sermon is called "How Do We Grow?" My guess is that I'm going to try to look at this from the perspective of how is Jesus growing into this this role as the leader, the sole leader of the revolution. I mean, I know in our mind he always has been, but if you're looking at it from the disciple community perspective, John was, initiated things. Jesus comes along and kind of takes the reins. So what we're seeing is there's some growth happening for Jesus. And we've seen these moments of growth before. Like when he's in the wilderness for 40 days, you see that kind of thing happening. And my guess is I'll probably show you some other stuff, like back when he was 12 and other moments of growth and change. I don't know where I want to go. I'm going to go this way. Anyway. But I think, we're going to take some of those base elements of growth, how we get from survival to more of a moving forward, thriving kind of a thing, and then apply them to how do I start figuring out how to always seek something more. Over the last year or so, I've been trying to, this has been kind of that year for me, where I've been trying to embrace places to get better in every way I can think of. And so I try to take every day and say, how do I make today better than yesterday? Or how do I improve somewhere? Because it's not about, for me, it's not about reaching some particular goal, and you can't do that with your faith either. It's not like you're gonna win all these God points and then you're gonna finally be there. But it's about, like, maybe deepening is a better word than improving, especially when we're talking about faith stuff. We want our faith life and the wholeness that we seek just as humans to be getting deeper, more enriching. Those sound like churchy words. Enriching and deepening. And that's what I'm hoping for too. I think to kind of rediscover myself a little bit, discover new things about myself, things I had never known before. That's a big part of it. This might just be my midlife crisis. I don't know. You get to be along there with the ride as I forge ahead closer and closer to my mid-40s. So congratulations. Anyway, that's, I think, part of the way I'm kind of looking at it. And what's interesting about this story, I mean, there's lots of interesting things. I don't know exactly where I'm going to focus on, but as I'm thinking about it now, what happens is Peter has this moment, and we can kind of break that moment down and say, like, he had the confidence to do this, and then he doubted, and then Jesus had this rebuking moment, and, you know, Peter got discouraged and he started to sink, and that whole thing. And, you know, what does that mean for our own faith? And I mean, that, you know, that's a very, very worthwhile thing to be talking about, and maybe I will. The thing that stuck out to me as I was reading it was, you know, the disciples, how do I say this? The disciples watched all this happen, and it was overwhelming, and it was, you know, amazing and all that stuff. They watch all this happen, and then they say, oh, truly you are the Son of God. And that's, you know, a big deal kind of moment. And then from there, what happens is, of course, they have this realization of who he is, which is cool. But then, of course, how many times do they just, like, completely forget that? And so it's you know, I mean, they backtrack. It's not like they see, oh, you're the Son of God, and then from there on out, they don't get anything wrong. You know, they just move ahead and they grow day by day. And that's not the way growth happens. Our health doesn't improve exactly incrementally. Our mental health certainly doesn't improve just incrementally. It's not the way it works. I can tell you it's not the way it works. The way it works is that you're going to have moments where you back up, right? You either have to go another way, choose that path or whatever, but you're gonna get lost occasionally. You're not gonna have any idea what's happening. It's going to be hard. You're gonna fall back. But the only thing you can do is to say, I have to keep this moving forward because that's what I think I'm called to do. That's what'll get me there. That's what'll lead me out and eventually lead to growth. And growing is hard too. And I think it's what you see in the disciples. You know, they got to watch it on the face of Jesus. They got to watch it with Peter. They got to think about, I wonder what I would have done if I would have been Peter. Or why wasn't I Peter? Or why didn't I go out with him? It's a lot to think about. But I think that is ultimately a big piece of it. I definitely am bringing the rain again, by the way, because it's like noticeably worse. Anyway, so I'm back in the park. I guess my hope for us is that you can spend a little time this week thinking about what does growth look like for you. How do we think about that in a holistic way? How do I think about growth of self, my empathetic growth in my faith, which I think the growth in your faith, the nice thing about it is that it kind of holds hands with both the self and the empathetic part, It's inward and outward, and so that's a good anchor. So if you're thinking about that, especially in terms of, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, I think that's my hope this week, is that you are able to spend a little bit of time just contemplating that for yourself, as I will. Well, that's our walk for the day. That's what I got. Thank you for helping me process what part 2 could look like. Thanks for being you. Thanks for joining me. I felt a raindrop, so I'm going to call it a day. I'll see you next time for another episode of First Look. Take care.